Thank you so much for your help.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's roll.
Okay.
I'm gonna sit down here. I just feel more, feel awkward.
Okay. All right. Just gonna get this.
I can be associate. I'm just gonna be behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
Hi, everyone.
Glory.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dane Rogers, and I'm the president of the Toledo Student Chapter of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies was founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is essential to our Constitution, and that is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is and not what it should be. The Society seeks both to promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. Our first speaker this afternoon is Professor Josh Blackman. Professor Blackman is an associate professor of law at the South Texas College of Law, who specializes in constitutional law, the United States Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. He is the founder and president of the Harlan Institute, the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, the internet's premier Supreme Court fantasy league, and blogs at joshblackman.com. Professor Blackman received his undergraduate degree from the Pennsylvania State University and his JD from the Antonin Scalia School of Law, then George Mason University Law School. After law school, Professor Blackman clerked for Judge Kim Gibson of the United States District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania. He then worked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit under Judge Danny Julian Boggs. Professor Blackman is the author of 3 books, and his latest, An Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 Supreme Court Cases Everyone Should Know, was named a top 5 bestseller on Amazon. Our commentator this afternoon is our very own Professor Rebecca Zitlow. Professor Zitlow is a distinguished university professor and the Charles W. Fornoff Professor of Law and Values at the University of Toledo College of Law, where she teaches constitutional law, federal courts, and constitutional litigation. Professor Zitlow received her BA from Barnard College and her JD from Yale Law School. After law school, Professor Zitlow clerked for Judge John F. Grady of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Professor Zitlow's scholarly interest is in the study of the Reconstruction era, including the meaning and history of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Her book, Enforcing Equality, Congress, the Constitution, and the Protection of Individual Rights, studies the history of congressional protection of rights and the implications of that history for constitutional theory. Professor Blackman will speak on the topic of free speech in higher education for 20 minutes, with Professor Zitlow providing commentary for about 10 to 15 minutes. There will be about a 10-minute allotted time limit for questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming Professor Josh Blackman.
Thank you. It is so good to see human faces. This is my first in-person lecture in almost 19 months. It's surreal to think I used to travel 100,000 miles a year. Starts with one trip to Detroit, I suppose, but hopefully good to be back in session. The topic today is free speech on campus. We are all familiar with the conflict. Some controversial speaker is invited to a university. Most students don't care one way or the other. Some students want to hear what the speaker has to say because they agree with him. For example, Dane probably agrees with me. Other students don't want to hear what the student has to say. And they may object, they may protest. Some students protest outside the event. Other students may protest inside the event. Some students may try to actually shout down the speaker, what might be called deplatforming. May try to disinvite the speaker. Now, the speaker may respond with aggression and shout back at the students, or may respond with conciliation and engage the students. Or the speaker may abandon the event altogether, perhaps on his own volition, or because the university forces him to leave. Invariably, the speaker is not able to give the lecture he wanted to give. The students who want to hear the speaker feel cheated. and the students who protested feel vindicated. And then all sides will disagree about whether heckler's veto succeeded. This conflict is personally familiar. It happened to me. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the City University of New York in Queens. The topic, ironically enough, was free speech on campus. About 30 students really wanted to hear me speak, and about 50 students protested my event. And the remainder of the 600 students really didn't care one way or the other. For about 8 minutes, a handful of protesters shouted at me and interrupted me. I couldn't speak more than a few words at a time. Eventually, I was able to engage the students with questions, and I sort of diffused the tension. I tried as best as I could to find common ground. Soon enough, the students who were protesting realized they were not going to get a reaction out of me, so they left. I never ended up giving the lecture I intended to give. Instead, I just took Q&A, ask me anything. I took questions for an hour and a half from the students. It was actually quite useful. To this day, I'm still conflicted about my experience at the CUNY Law School in New York. I can approach it from my personal perspective. It was kind of intimidating, but I got over it. But also my legal perspective, because I'm a huge, robust champion of free speech. I have free speech rights, and so do the students. I've never been protested before, and knock on wood, have not been protested since, although maybe you guys will prove me wrong today, I don't know. Before the event, I met with the campus security, and they asked me what my exit strategy was. My exit strategy? How would I leave the building in the event of an emergency? In other words, if they had to rush me out of the building, where was I going? And at that moment, I realized that sometimes these protests can affect personal safety. It's not just people screaming at you. They can throw invectives. I won't show you the video here, but they basically surrounded me. So if you can imagine where those chairs are right behind me, were about a dozen people standing holding up signs, only a few feet away from me. These sorts of protests can lead to violence. Fortunately, nothing happened. I'm not here with a plea for sympathy. Please don't get me wrong. I am a tenured law professor, and I lecture across the country on controversial topics. I invite these sorts of reactions. I'm fully aware of that. I think these sorts of protests come with the territory. If you're not saying something worthwhile, people aren't going to protest you. So I feel that I'm getting these protests because I'm saying something that's resonating. Rather, in my time here today, and I'm grateful to the chapters for inviting me, I want to try to discuss this objectively. I'll try, see if I succeed. And I think there are 4 primary parts to my talk. First, we have to understand why are certain speakers invited to campus, right? I'm not a professor here. I don't teach torts. I don't teach property. I'm not giving you the rule against perpetuities. I've been invited here to talk about a specific topic, right? The second question is a little bit harder. Why do students protest speakers, right? What's the purpose of these various protests? Which I think is a really tough question. Third, how do students protest speakers? I think there are different ways and different means by which this is accomplished. The fourth part is a very difficult one that maybe the future associate dean can opine on. How do you respond to student protests? Shutting down the protest, shutting down the speaker. And is there discipline involved? All right, so those are the 4 parts. You'll see my face for 15 seconds. I'll get a sip of water. I do my best to keep this mask on, but projecting with Professor Zietlow will agree, projecting with a mask on creates a lot of fog in the glasses. So I have to sort of do one of these every now and then, okay? So my first point, why are certain speakers invited to campus? I think the answer to that question is different today than it was decades ago. Before YouTube, right, before social media, if you wanted to hear what someone had to say, you had to see them in person, right? Most people didn't have access to mainstream TV, or even cable news didn't exist, right? You need to have it. So Professor Zietlow was at Yale. I'm sure they had a bunch of speakers come by who were speaking on some very heady topics of the day. I think that dynamic is not as true today, and especially not true after the pandemic, because we are able to see speakers on Zoom who we would never come to Toledo, right? But still, there's a value that I think each and every one of you agree that you're seeing me here in flesh and blood is different than watching me in a little Zoom square, right? And why is that distinct? There's feedback and interaction. We will have time at the end of today to have Q&A. You don't get that on Zoom, and you guys know that well after a year and a half of online education. But my question is a little more profound. Why are certain speakers brought to campus? Why am I here, right? Why did they invite me to come all the way up to Toledo? Often it's to provide a perspective that may not otherwise be present in your classes. Maybe I have an obscure area of scholarship. Maybe I've written about a topic that's of interest, or maybe I have a different philosophy, right? Maybe I approach issues a different way than those who are here. Outside speakers fill a void that students perceive. Whether that void is real or not, you can argue forever, but it fills a void. So having outside speakers is important. And I think it's important that groups have the autonomy to invite their own speakers without seeking approval. There are some schools in this country where student groups need permission, approval, to invite a speaker. And that gives a lot of ground for viewpoint discrimination. And schools say, no, you can come, but you can't come. So I think it's a very basic tenet of academic freedom that students have autonomy to invite speakers without seeking some sort of viewpoint-based approval. Okay? But with that autonomy comes potential controversy, right? Students may not want to just invite boring speakers. They may want to invite people who rile people up, right? Now, I'm not throwing invectives, I'm not cursing. I think I'm pretty sober. I think I am at least. But not all speakers are like that. Why do some student groups invite speakers who rile things up? It gets attention, right? There's a very famous Supreme case called Terminello from the 1940s. One of the functions of free speech is to invite dispute, the court says, right? Very often you learn the most when there's some sort of confrontation, dispute. Having a bland debate is lovely, but sometimes you need to have a vigorous debate, right? Maybe you get persuaded, maybe you don't. All right, let me move on to the second part of my talk. Why do students protest? Very hard question, and I don't think I'll answer it to your satisfaction. But I think at a basic level, there's a philosophical disagreement. There's perhaps the perception that this speaker is presenting a view that they might disagree with, or they might find offensive, or they find that these views may promote a philosophy that they oppose. They think that these speeches may lead to hate, or maybe even lead to violence. And on one level, it makes sense. Someone's bringing some speech you don't like to campus, so you respond likewise with speech, right? Speech against speech is good. That's how things work. So I really have no objection to protests. I don't. In fact, when I was at the CUNY Law School, about 50 students were in the hallway leading to the classroom, holding up signs, chanting, and screaming at me. I thought that was pretty cool, actually. I mean, to be perfectly frank, it scared the crap out of me. But I thought it was pretty cool that they took the time out of their day to assemble, make signs, organize, and come out against me because they really didn't like what I had to say. And I was okay with that. I was actually impressed that they were using their speech rights to try to counter my speech. So that's great. One guy was a bit of a jerk. He tried to block him from going to the classroom. He sort of stood in front of the door with his backpack, and I kind of nudged him, and it was over quickly. But I was okay with the protests. Where it became not okay is where they sort of prevent you from speaking, where they sort of stood around me, were screaming over me. Then I think a line is drawn. And that leads to sort of the third part of my talk today. How do students protest? Perhaps the most unknown aspect of this dynamic is a disinvitation, where a speaker is invited and then he's uninvited, so he never shows up. It's very hard to even know that happens, Because when he doesn't show up, you don't know about it. The only people who know are the students involved. And generally, they don't make a big fuss when their speaker's canceled because they don't want to become embarrassed. I know there are law schools in this country that have uninvited speakers. I know it happens. The dean says, no way, you're not bringing this person to campus. And not all these people are evil, right? And this is even before 2016. This is from many moons ago. When student groups invite a speaker, I think there should be a very strong presumption they're allowed to attend. And I also think groups should be allowed to have discretion of who to invite. Even when there's pressure from students, I hope the university doesn't cave. CUNY, for all their warts, didn't cave. They allowed my speech to go forward at the law school. There are other ways that students protest. One is by discouraging attendance. Again, I'm okay with this, right? If there's a speaker coming to your campus and you don't want him to be there, you can say, don't attend, skip it, right? Hand out flyers saying that this person is not good, don't go to his event. The best way to minimize a person is to have an empty auditorium. I mean, I'm looking at this huge auditorium here, but the seats are filled, right? I'm okay with this. This is good. But when I walk into a room that's totally empty, I'm like, wow, that kind of sucks. It deflates you. So I think a fairly effective way is to perhaps protest outside the event, but leave the room empty. And indeed, at CUNY, after all the protests are finished, the room emptied out, and there were like 5 people left. I was having a nice conversation with 5 people. Okay. Another way they can object is by demonstrating. I draw a line between demonstration and disruption. I think these are 2 different concepts, right? Demonstrating is speaking outside, holding up signs. If you're screaming outside the room so you can't hear anything inside, that does disrupt. But I think demonstrations are quite fine outside the event. You can also demonstrate inside the event, standing in the back of the room, quietly holding signs. You're not disrupting anyone, you're not blocking anyone's view, you're not obstructing access, you're simply standing in the back of the room, holding up signs. That, I think, is also very effective. Another approach, the walkout. As soon as I start talking, you get up and you quietly leave the room. I think that's a very strong message in a respectful fashion that doesn't disrupt. But disruptions do cause a problem. I think there are a couple kinds of disruptions. One is visual disruption. That would be standing either right in front of me or standing right behind me, or in some schools, blocking the projector so you can't see the PowerPoint. In some schools, you block the projector itself. You put a piece of paper in front of the projector. Right? I've seen that before. Right? By blocking visual, you are denying your colleagues, your classmates, the ability to see what I'm trying to bring to campus. And then there's audible disruptions. That's screaming, that's chanting over me. Right? Any good speaker will give students at the end a chance to speak. We have a microphone right there. You can all ask me questions in a few minutes, right? But there's a sequence to these things. I go first, you go second, right? I'll give you a chance to speak if you let me get my point out first, and I'll do this as quickly as I can. Now, the CUNY kids were protesting me by screaming and shouting. I didn't try to shout over them. I was actually sort of mentally prepared because they tipped me off that there might be a protest. So I sort of thought about my strategy in advance. I wasn't going to get into a shouting match because I would lose a shouting match. There were about, in the classroom, about a dozen of them and one of me, right? You can't out-scream 15 people. Also, the emotions are on their side. When someone's emotional and sort of shouting at you, you're not going to talk them off the ledge. So I had a different strategy. I simply let them get it out of their system. I let them get it out. In fact, I actually started the event about 15 minutes late, so they were really going. They got all their energy out, and they sort of pettered out. And when they saw I wasn't going to fight them, they just left because they realized I wasn't going to fight them. I think that's a meaningful way to respond, but not everyone can do that, right? It's somewhat intimidating to be screamed at, but I was sort of ambivalent. I said, okay, they're screaming at me, whatever, not my problem. Still, other speakers may simply say, no way, right? I am not walking into a protest. I'm going to skip the event. I'm going to cancel it. And at that point, the protesters have won. They were not going to shut me down. So was my CUNY event disrupted? I think I told you for about 8 minutes they were shouting at me, and then after that they left, and I had a normal enough event. The dean of the law school, who actually is no longer there, she resigned under. Just Google it, the CUNY dean. She resigned under weird circumstances. Said my talk was not disrupted because it was only 8 minutes, and then for another hour or so, I was able to give my presentation. I don't know if that's the right approach, sort of like a numerator denominator, right? How much was I protested versus how much was I not protested? I think it's kind of a weird way of looking at it. But without question, they disrupted my ability to give the talk I wanted to, right? Once I realized that these are the circumstances, I sort of threw my talk out the window. I did a Q&A. So I think there was a disruption. Now, the fourth part of my talk, which I think is perhaps maybe the dean can weigh in this as well. Are you dean yet, Rebecca, or soon to be? Okay, someone said something about dean. I'm sorry. The future associate dean. Okay. So how do universities respond to disruptions, right? So I think there are 4 approaches. First is do nothing, right? Do nothing. Let the speaker fend for himself, which is more or less what happened at CUNY, right? They did nothing. They had one plainclothes security guy in the back of the room who, frankly, was not going to do a damn thing. He told me, look, all I can do is remove you from the room. I can't do much more than that. Right? So there's the do nothing approach. That puts a lot of pressure on the speaker to sort of manage his own affairs and even his own security. That might let some speakers simply to say, this ain't worth it. I am not going to put myself through this stress and anxiety to deal with this, right? There's another approach, which is where you ask the disruptors to stop. Ask them. Notice I said ask. I didn't say order, I said ask. And CUNY tried that, right? About 10 minutes into the presentation, they had I think it was an associate dean come in. I didn't even catch her name. She never said a word to me. And she said, don't stop him from speaking, or else I'll be back. That's just like Arnold, right? I'll be back. She never came back, right? It was an empty threat. She just wanted to show face, which is fine. The students basically ignored her, which usually when you ignore a dean, you get in trouble. Well, maybe in my school. But when the dean says to do something and you ignore them, you share some consequences. There are no consequences here. So I appreciate that they sent someone to try to stop her, even if the effort was superficial. There's a third option. Removing students from the room. This one gets tricky because it involves physical force, right? I'm sure you've seen on social media, right? Trying to remove someone from a room creates a huge scene because the person invariably will go limp and go on the ground. You have to either pick them up by their ankles and drag them, or even put zip tie. I don't think this approach is going to be justified unless there's threat of physical violence. I'll make a carve out. If they're just shouting, you don't tie them up. You don't drag them out of the room. I think, unfortunately, you have to sort of give warnings. Now, the closer call, I think, is after the event, right? After the disruption, do you impose discipline? Every school has an honor code. I think this school probably does, right? Every school has some sort of disciplinary code. It's in writing. You can all read it. I think at most institutions, even state institutions, disrupting a speaker by shouting over him is not permitted under the conduct code. What do you do? Well, suppose you can simply give a warning. If you do this again, you'll be in trouble. There's different types of disciplinary actions. Perhaps they can have to not be eligible for extracurricular activities. Maybe just a stern reprimand from the dean. There are different ways of handling it. To be perfectly frank, I don't think any of these things are productive, right? If there's even a disciplinary action imposed, it's going to be long after the actual event, people have forgotten about it, right? And law school is kind of a cycle where every year there's a fresh new crop of students who don't remember what happened last year, which is both good and bad, I suppose. So even if you make a big fuss for the current school year, the next year's crop won't even remember. So there's not much of an institutional memory. So my conclusion is not very optimistic or perhaps not very effective. I don't think there's much you can do ex post, right? After it happens, there's really not much you can do. The best way to approach this topic is ex ante, that is beforehand. It's to, I think, the dean and the administration can realize that might be an issue, and explain to students why it's important to have speakers on campus, even those whom you disagree with. And maybe they can talk about possible ways of demonstrating that are respectful or not. But once it happens, I think the cat's out of the bag. Using some sort of force to remove a speaker, bad idea. Imposing disciplinary actions, bad idea. Even though the students at CUNY protested me, I don't think I favor disciplining any of them. I wouldn't. Even despite it happens, like, you know what? They screwed up. I think they made a mistake, but especially at a state institution, CUNY is a public school, I don't think they could. Now, if you notice, I have not mentioned the First Amendment at all to this point. I think these values apply equally to both a public and a private university because universities play a unique role in our system, right? They're very important academic institutions for free thought and free expression. And you will be exposed to ideas you like or dislike, but you should respond respectfully. All right, I've been speaking for almost half an hour. You all have been very quiet and respectful. I'm going to give Professor Zietlow some time to hear thoughts. And I'll be happy to take some of the questions afterwards. Thank you all so much.
He's a little bit taller than I am. I want to thank the Federalist Society for inviting me to comment on Professor Blackman. We've known each other for years and in various common law conferences and contexts and stuff, so it's good to see him here. Nice to have him. As I told him, I don't really, we couldn't do a debate because I don't really necessarily disagree with what you're saying. I agree that free speech is a core value in our society, reflected in the First Amendment protection, freedom of expression, but also, yes, in general principles, especially in higher education. It's very important. The free exchange of ideas are crucial. Students learn how to think critically about the world as a central part of their education. And so it's really important that we be able to have this free exchange of ideas. And there's a strong tradition of academic freedom in colleges and universities for a reason. Professor Blackman mentioned tenure, which congratulations, he's been granted tenure. And one of the reasons why we have tenure in academia is to protect professors who make controversial arguments in their work, and that's really important. Speakers like Professor Blackman have a right to speak and shouldn't be blocked from doing so. But students also have a right to protest. What this reminds me of something that happened, you mentioned Yale. My very first, I don't think classes had even started yet, when I arrived on campus, and a group of students had decided they wanted to show a film called Deep Throat, which is a pornographic film that had been called obscene by the courts and banned, and was the subject of important litigation. I think it was a Supreme Court case. Anyway, they wanted to show it on campus, and there was a protest. A lot of people thought that should not be shown. It wasn't appropriate. It was demeaning to women and misogynistic. And our dean at the time, who was the legendary Guido Calabresi, who's just this really lively guy, about this tall, I mean, just an amazing person. And he said, I absolutely, First Amendment, academic freedom, this show, we're going to allow this film to be shown, but I'm going to picket in front. So there he was picketing the showing of the film. And I think that's in the sort of the tradition of free speech. We could deconstruct that a little bit more, but we're not going to right now. And outside speakers really enrich the academic environment, as Professor Blackman mentioned. Why do we bring outside speakers in? To bring more ideas in, right, and more perspectives. And I think that Professor Blackman did an effective job of laying out the tension between free speech rights of students and speakers. And I do think this is, we have seen this as a growing problem in just today's polarized political environment, right? But Professor Blackman's talk, or at least that we were told, was free speech in higher education, or freedom of expression in higher education. But he left out what I think is the real threat, a really big threat to free expression in higher education right now, which is the attack on the teaching of critical race theory, which affects not just outside speakers, but the core curriculum and the job security of teachers and professors. In the past 6 months, 8 states have passed laws banning the teaching of critical race theory, and 20 others, including Ohio, are considering this now. There's a debate going on right now in the Ohio State Legislature. And I have with me the bill that passed in Iowa, and there's a list of 10 things that people are not allowed to teach about in either primary, secondary education or in higher education, including the idea that one race or sex is superior to other, that members of a particular race are inherently inclined to oppress others, and that the US and the state are fundamentally racist or sexist. Now, the biggest impact of these laws will be on local education, and especially high school, where some teachers have been fired. A principal in Texas black principal in Texas was suspended for teaching or promoting critical race theory. And so there's several problems with this. First of all, it's not defined. And polls show that most people don't even know what it is. And so this broad language, this broad ideas leads to the danger of viewpoint discrimination, makes it difficult and confusing for educators to respond. It has a chilling effect. Colleges have canceled courses or made them optional that are that include discussion of racism and systemic oppression of people of color. Untenured professors are dissuaded from studying this history and writing scholarship that might be called critical race theory or informed by critical race theory, and they're afraid of losing their jobs or not getting their job security that they would get from tenure. It has an impact on students who are in danger of being unable to learn about central facts of our history, on our increasingly diverse society that's grappling with how to deal with continued impact of system of racism. And Professor Blackman mentioned that my area of expertise is Reconstruction, and which continues to this day, the debates over Reconstruction. And one of the things we know is, as legal historians on Reconstruction, is the extent to which the history and the denial of our history has been used in the past to justify legal systems of oppression, including Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws in the South, which required segregation, prohibited African Americans from voting, treated them as second-class citizens. The Dunning School of History was used professors justified this, said, for example, that people who were enslaved were happy and content. I've spent the summer reading a number of books that were written in the 1940s about fugitives from slavery, and it was amazing to me the extent of effort that the professors felt they had to just explain how that, in fact, it was wrong that people who were enslaved liked being in slavery. So, I mean, that's just an example that comes from our history, and there's a danger. So, and also that the teaching of the history of racism in our country has always been somewhat politicized. And I really see this as a significant threat to academic freedom that I think it's, with all due respect to Professor Blackman, I think it's a deeper threat than speakers coming from other schools who have job security at other schools that may or may not be able to give the talk that they, and I do think that's important, and I agree with him that that's important, but I think this is even more important because it goes to the whole curriculum and what we can teach and learn about in universities. So knowledge is power, and that's why you guys are here, right? You're here to learn. And it's essential for dealing with complex issues of the day. Freedom of expression is essential in higher education for speakers that I think you identify as conservative
Libertarian.
or libertarian, like Professor Blackman, but also for all professors who teach about the difficult subjects in all our disciplines. So I hope we can have a little conversation about this. And again, I'm guessing he doesn't disagree with me either. But anyway.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there's actually a common thread with Professor Zitlow's remarks and mine, which is that academics should be given the sort of space to define their own pursuits. I think that that's something that should not be taken lightly. Most members of the State House probably don't know much about Reconstruction or don't know much about CRT or anything of that nature, critical racial theory. So I generally take a laissez-faire approach. Let me perhaps bring it back to my talk. There are a number of state legislatures that have actually tried to enact statutes that mandate discipline for student protesters. Have you seen these, Rebecca? So Arizona and others have basically said that universities stand to lose funding if they permit certain types of disruptions. And these bills have been framed in better and worse ways. Probably some are clearly unconstitutional. Some may actually pass muster. I haven't made up my mind yet. But I was actually asked if I would endorse some of these bills given my protest, and I said, no, I'm not interested. I don't think that state houses should be, or they should be very hesitant to intercede in how these institutions are run. And absent some evidence that there's a really clear dereliction of duty, I think they should probably keep their hands off with the student discipline issue. So I think there's a synergy between them. I see it's 12:40, and I understand you guys have class at 12:50. So is now a good time for Q&A, Dean? Okay. So, oh yeah, Mike got that. Okay, excellent. Okay, so please, if you have a question, maybe raise your hand, and then the mic will be brought to you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I had a quick question, and it kind of goes to both points. We obviously, in law school, we understand the importance of free speech and First Amendment. And I also understand the importance of academic freedom. So I was just wondering, you guys' thoughts. And, you know, a lot of the discussion was when we have outside speakers come in or when there are outside forces now letting a teacher or professor teach certain curriculum. So I was wondering, and then a lot of discussion was on protesting and countering speech and things of that nature. But how do we go about when, let's say, we have a professor with academic freedom and tenure or whatever, and then there are certain speech that is not viewed as, not to say right or wrong, but like wrong. There's so much protesting you can do, and I feel like that is not to say that this teacher would have to not have their freedom of speech or have their academic freedom taken away, but I feel like there has to be a point in higher education, especially when someone who is teaching you about biology or what have you needs to have an understanding that speech that can be considered hateful or towards marginalized groups have an impact on students, and then it just kind of lowers their ability to learn, which is what they're in higher education for. So there's so much protesting that can be done when that kind of speech comes out. So I was just wondering, thoughts, feelings, because I feel like that's something that needs to be discussed, because it's not an outside speaker, but it's not impeding on their curriculum. It's still a professor that might have troubling views, and then what are the students supposed to do other than just feel comfortable and I don't attend those classes anyways, and just be a detriment to their education maybe.
Thank you. Really good question. There were a lot of parts. I hope I hit all of them. If I don't, please tell me. I will make sure I answer your question. I think there's a couple components to our question. So one is, let's say you have a biology professor who wants to teach about creationism. I think that might be what you were hinting at, biology. I think university could say that your scholarship is so repudiated that there's no basis for it, that you should not be teaching from, if you're teaching a class in the evolution, you should be teaching from Darwin and not the Bible. I think that's a fair thing for any institution to say. Sort of an extreme example, but I think that's an easy one, right? Another one is what happens if a student is exposed to material that may make them feel offended, and we can do this on different levels, right? Let's say there's a lecture on slavery, or let's say you have a 1L class criminal law teaching the topic of rape, which is something that is still a law in all 50 states. Or perhaps you're teaching about eugenics, which is something we do teach about in constitutional law, forcible sterilization, abortion, gay rights, persecution of Native Americans. Pick whatever topic you want, right? The 1L curriculum is littered with topics that could make students feel upset in different regards. I think professors do have discretion to teach it in a manner. And so long as you're exposed to this information for the purpose of teaching something else, I think it's okay. If you're simply using these lessons as a way to sort of needle students and maybe make them feel belittled, that may be a different story. But if you're teaching about criminal law and there's a unit on rape and there's a student perhaps who's been a victim or been affected by rape, I think the answer is it's difficult. You might have to sit through something that you're not wanting to. Another issue is use of slurs, right? You know them. I don't have to repeat them. I don't use them in my class because I think it's counterproductive. It will create such a disruption that I don't want to waste time on it. But some professors who do use them, right, to illustrate how language is used, how certain words can have power over people. And using an abbreviation may not be as good as using the actual word. That I think is probably the biggest controversy today. Some schools defend the professors, others do not, others issue lukewarm statements. But then the back part of your question is, what happens to a student in that class who doesn't want to be there, right? Do they get reassigned? Or perhaps you tell this professor you cannot teach a mandatory 1L class, you have to only teach upper level, people can choose to be in that class, right? That also goes to academic freedom issues because you're telling a professor what they can and cannot teach, and they might be required. The short answer is you have a very thoughtful question that touched on a lot of different areas. I don't have a simple answer, but I appreciate that there can be varied responses to each aspect. Professor Ziegler, do you want to add anything to that question? No? Okay, that's fine.
Hello. I'm usually louder than the mic, but I'll use it today. So my question kind of goes into debates in academic space with higher education. So part of debate is good for higher education, but one thing my old debate coach and some professors would like to say is in order to have proper debate and rigorous debates here at academic spaces, there must be a sense of goodwill or good faith between those who are debating, talking about the topics like that. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about what do students, and either students do or professors do when there are those in the spaces operating in bad faith, using these ideas not to have the honest conversation, but to shut ones down, or to put on stances they don't necessarily believe, but only to crack faith and anger to the space.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll speak to people perhaps from my own camp and the other side. You know the expression "own the libs," right? I'm sure you've heard it. There's some speakers who engage in sort of outrage for the purpose of creating outrage, right? They say shocking things not because it leads to some sort of discussion or debate, but because they want to upset people. You ever see The People Against Larry Flint? You ever see that movie? Oh God, I'm dating myself. Anyway, Larry Flint was a publisher of Hustler, right? And he was, it's a pornographic magazine, but he was insistent on making the biggest possible outrage because he was so committed to the First Amendment. He would publish, the famous case maybe read in Torts, Hustle v. Falwell. Remember that case where he published? It was a satire of Jerry Falwell, an evangelical, talking about having sex with his mother, right? And he did that for the sole purpose of creating an outrage. Was Larry Flint, who was no Republican, he was not a conservative, was Larry Flint some kind of bad faith actor, or was he someone truly committed to free speech? So I'm going to agree with your question in like 99% of, thank you, Zillow. I'll agree with your question like 99% of the cases, but there might be some people who the reason why they engage in such outrageous conduct is to fight for the principle of free speech itself, which very well might involve something that looks like bad faith, like calling Jerry Falwell's, a pedophile to sleep with his mother or whatever it was. But it's a good question. I try to be in good faith. I'm here with all of you, having a good discussion, but I know there are some people who aren't. I don't meet many law professors in that context, right? Undergraduate, I think you have some speakers who fall in that mold, but I tend to think law professors are a little bit different. But that's my perspective. Thank you for the question. I got a question up here in the front, orange shirt.
We'll probably have time for these next two questions, just so I can.
So yeah, my question is, how do you view the balance between the legal community and we see lawyers and the judges even are supposed to be agents for justice and the right constitutional interpretation versus also the other side that courts are to be, there's a rule against political questions and also deferential to the more political branches like Congress and the president, and obviously in the states, the same thing.
Well, look, I think it's very hard for the courts to do anything meaningful here. And for a simple reason, courts move very slowly and academic institutions move quickly, right? If one of you were to sue me or I were to sue you, the case would not go to trial until you've all graduated, right? So I think courts are very bad institutions to handle disciplinary issues in campus, which is why I think it should be handled internally. I think bringing courts in is generally a bad idea. Sometimes you do have long-running disputes. These cases take years to litigate, but I don't think courts are in a good spot to really resolve these issues in a timely fashion to actually give students the sort of resolution that they demand. Maybe one more question before you guys have to go to class? Yes, right there.
Hi, again, just echoing what my colleague said, we appreciate you being here. Thank you for that. My question is really simple. I think part of being in a learning environment is respecting opinions that you disagree with. But what do you do when those protected speeches actually hurt? I think so often we focus on, well, that's protected. That is okay. But at the same time, what do you do when you read stuff about yourself that someone that you inevitably may not know much about, but you reference them as a person of, great character, and you want to rely on the things that they say. And because they're part of your community, because you are part of this community, if that makes sense, what do you do when that person says something about you that actually hurts?
Yeah, no, I hear you, and it's a good question. I am somewhat of a public figure that's criticized, perhaps not the same way others are, but I have hurtful things said about me on a daily basis. I don't check my Twitter notifications anymore. I stopped a long time ago because it was not worth my time. I can tell you, get a thick skim. I know that doesn't have much meaning, right? Because it's at some point things really do start to get to you. And I understand why today there's this increasing sort of second thinking about free speech. Like, why are we protecting these ideals, right? I would leave you perhaps with one thought. What goes around sort of comes around. If we were to weaken free speech protection so that you can do something about that hurt today, those same laws can then be used against you in some future generation. Right? In other words, once you weaken free speech standards, they're gone. I'll use an example. Right? What if you were a professor in the 1950s or 60s on a campus and you want to argue that the Constitution protects the right to gay marriage? Right? You've been subject to ridicule. Right? You've been thrown off campus. Some institutions would say, you can have that view, but we'll protest it, right? Even though it's sort of hurtful. But the ability to have that space to speak about a topic people find hurtful led to movements that have grown today in bold ways. So we can't only look at the instant moment in time that if there's this hurt and there's pain, so we have to sort of change the standards, because in 10, 15, 50 years, your grandchildren may be facing a different world where they're going to be the ones who are engaging in this sort of controversial speech, and they're going to want to have the space to do it. But I don't want to minimize what you're saying. I do think it's an absolutely fair point. And it's not enough to just say, toughen up, get thick skin, because it sucks, right? It does. And, don't Google me, but if you do, people say some pretty crappy things about me, but I certainly got past it. Or maybe you have already Googled me, I don't know. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much for your attention, respect, and I'm happy to answer other questions when I come up afterwards. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I think I'll do this. This is the COVID bump. All right, thank you all so much.
And then Sean, right here, the guy who